Good morning. I'm going to talk to you today about the tragic double standard that exists today about accountability in development. What do we mean by democratic accountability? I think here I'm just giving a reminder about Civics 101, that citizens can exercise their votes and their voice, to penalize the government when it does something negative to the citizens, and to reward the government when it does something positive, that they give feedback to the government and the government is held accountable to respond to that feedback. Now, contrary to a lot of the talk in the development establishment, this requires a lot more than just majority voting. It requires a much broader concept of democracy, that it requires the right to dissent. The dissenters must be protected against arbitrary imprisonment and torture and disappearances. It requires freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection of rights for minorities. Above all, the principle that all are equal before the law for all individuals. Now, the double standard I want to talk about is maybe exemplified by some of the language that we use when we talk about accountability and democracy for rich people versus the language we use on poor people. So for rich people, I think you'll recognize this quotation. This is sort of the values that in rich societies are universally accepted now, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words still resonate after 234 years. For poor people, the contrast to this really stirring and inspirational language is language something like this. This is what I read in typical aid documents. Instead of saying what's on the left here, they say something like this. We're going to promote partnerships for mainstreaming country ownership and participation by civil society stakeholders to promote inclusive empowerment for community-based development. Oh my God, I'm so blown away with inspiration at this point. How many of you just really felt butterflies in your stomach when we were reading that second quote? You know, you just felt like, I'm going to go out there and fight for mainstreaming country ownership and participation by civil society stakeholders. There are really two types of accountability that are missing today in development. First, that official aid agencies do not accept that they themselves are accountable to the intended beneficiaries of their actions. And second, that the aid and development establishment appears indifferent to whether governments and poor societies are accountable to their citizens. And I want to document that, both of these, in this talk. Now, number two might seem a little extreme. Surely everyone agrees that government should be accountable to their citizens. But what I had on a few slides ago to be this, the aid and development establishment is very far from recognizing this for the poor, even though it's universally accepted for the rich. So let me give some ideas. To document the indifference of the World Bank, for example, to these ideals of rights and accountability, I did my own sort of archaeological research. I kind of felt like I was, sifting through the shards of some ancient, mysterious, enigmatic civilization called World Bank, reading very long reports with titles like these, which appear to be about something about government accountability, and reports like these, which seem to be something about participation and accountability, and then this other report these are all very long reports. So let me tell you a secret. I didn't actually necessarily read every one of them from cover to cover. I made liberal use of the Acrobat feature, find words. So These documents are the ones that inspired me to give you the mainstreaming, inclusiveness, civil society, stakeholders, because these documents are full of those words. But here's some words that are missing in these documents. The words that are missing are words like these: liberty, rights, freedom, equality, democracy. So these latter set of words, these are the words that historically resonate because they are associated with the real battle of the oppressed against the oppressors over the past 2 centuries for greater rights and freedom for the citizens. These are the real words. But the aid establishment is substituting those buzzwords that I gave you earlier to evade the real words. Another rhetorical strategy that I found in these documents is the famous transition defense, which has the advantage of being completely irrefutable, non-falsifiable in scientific language. So the idea of transition is, even if some government, some tyranny that the aid agencies are financing right now looks awful, it's okay because it's in transition. So this is the transition defense. It's in transition to becoming a, ideal democracy with rights for all. And so, there's no country that the advantage of this defense is you can defend aid to all countries because all countries are in this transition. So even, the DR Congo in 2001, when it had, 7 rampaging foreign armies and 14 different warlords tearing apart the country, USAID detected that this was a country in transition to a democratic free market society. That transition 9 years later is still not all that clear, but that's the USAID view. And then the World Bank on Ethiopia, they use the transition defense to justify supporting the current autocratic regime in Ethiopia, which they're directly financing. And they responded to a very critical article by Helen Epstein in the New York Review of Books on tyranny in Ethiopia, and criticized the World Bank for supporting this tyranny. And so here was the World Bank country director on Ethiopia giving the transition defense. Our task is to support the innate tendency towards accountability. However, building institution takes a long time, changes are incremental, and at times they may suffer serious setbacks. So this is the perfect defense because it's completely irrefutable. So things are bad now, well, don't worry, there's an innate tendency towards greater accountability. There has just been some horrible event where the government did something very, very awful to some citizens or peaceful opposition members. Well, don't worry, that's just a temporary setback to this innate tendency towards building institutions. So you can never, there's no government that can ever be bad enough for the World Bank to say, no, we're not going to finance you, because you can always summon this transition defense that is irrefutable, because we don't know the future. The World Bank can always tell us that the future, is sort of like the way the church used to offer the hope of heaven, that the future does contain this ideal state of democracy sometime in the future, and the trend is upward, and since we don't know their future, we can't prove them wrong. So in practice, what this means is aid is financing an awful lot of, frankly, dictatorships. This is the share of aid by the Freedom House classifications of free, part free, and unfree. And you can see the share of unfree and part free has stayed amazingly constant over 40 years now, despite all the changing debates and attitudes and discussions about democracy. It's still the same case that today aid is financing dictatorships. And the story that this was only something that happened during the Cold War and the aid agencies no longer do that, that's not supported by these data. The share of dictatorships is the same as it was during the Cold War. And so to give you an example of, I usually don't like making up words, but I envy other people who make up words that get accepted, so I thought I'd try to make up a word and see if it caught on with you guys. Just call them aidocrats. Paul Biya, been in power in Cameroon since 1982, has gotten 35 billion in aid. Mr. Deby in Chad has only been able to be in power since 1990, and he's running a very small country, but he's still got 6 billion. The late Mr. Conte in Guinea, before he would still be receiving aid, except for the World Bank does have, the World Bank does not operate with total impunity. They do have some standards. They require that the dictator be not dead to receive aid. So they did cut off aid to Mr. Conte after he died, but before that he'd gotten 11 billion. And then, the other alarming thing that shows the donors' apparent indifference to democracy is that they know that their aid is being politically manipulated, but they continue to give aid. So a report on Ethiopia just came out by Human Rights Watch, which documented the manipulation of aid with quotes like these, that an emergency relief program that was literally making the difference between, starvation and surviving was limited to ruling party members. An opposition leader told Human Rights Watch that their children were malnourished in his village, or because they are not members of a family that supports the ruling party, and so they're starving to death. So you cannot get any more political manipulative than that. When this report came out, the donors just simply denied that these things existed, even though they had been documented by Human Rights Watch, and they continue to support Ethiopia, current autocratic government, with the same amount of aid or even more. So one thing I wanted to do, and to start wrapping down the talk, is talk to you a little bit about the history of the double standard in development, to see just how remarkably persistent it is over time. So, of course, this is going to challenge a little bit the conventional wisdom that in the old days people of European origin were racist and colonialist, and now we're not, and so we've really changed our attitude towards double standards for, Europeans and non-Europeans. Now, I'm not going to accuse anyone today of being racist or colonialist. I'm just going to show that this idea of the radical break with the past is not true, that there actually has been a lot of continuity from the past to the present. So let me just give you an example of how deeply rooted the double standard has been for a couple of centuries now. This is one of my heroes, John Stuart Mill, the great economist, who is also known as the great advocate for individual liberty with his classic essay, Individual Liberty. And he gives these stirring words that the individual is sovereign over his own mind and body. This sounds great. This is why he's my hero. But alas, on this occasion, he has really let me down, because he said, sorry, the backward states of society, and is using, of course, very insulting language that would no longer be fully acceptable today, although we find euphemisms that say similar things in less offensive language. He said, sorry, backward states of society are not eligible for these. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government for these backward states of society. And, so just in case there's any doubt in your mind, he announces that he indeed has a double standard. Liberty has no application to any such state of things. That is, he means to non-European peoples. This is the, unashamed, unapologetic statement of the double standard. Now, over time, the statements of the double standard become increasingly apologetic, but they still give a double standard. So when the League of Nations was founded, they used language like this, which is almost like development language today, but again, a little bit more offensive than would be accepted today, that the tutelage of people not able to stand by themselves should be entrusted to advanced nations. And actually, the key player in founding the League of Nations was Jan Smuts of South Africa, the Prime Minister of South Africa, who had put this in racial terms before with this very offensive quote that the white race should act as trustees for the colored races in Africa. The British Empire, during the war, they they start, they keep softening the language over time, but the double standard survives. They say, now we're going to start thinking about betterment of the backward peoples of the world. But sorry, political liberty is not available. They're meaningless. And the colonial office at that time did not anticipate that colonialism was going to end soon. They said that the colonies were not fit for complete independence for centuries. And then the UN, when it was founded, it's used similar language about the advancement of all peoples. But to realize how much the double standard is still alive at this point is that the preamble was actually written by this same Jan Smuts. He was not only doing the League of Nations, he was also doing the UN and using the same language, that the British were the greatest colonial powers and dependent peoples. And the UN preamble and mandate and charter in 1945 said absolutely nothing about any greater rights for the colonial peoples or for any hint of independence of the colonies at that time. Now, the World Bank, which founded about the same time, they had probably the most inventive solution to the whole problem of the double standard, to say, and actually this is much smarter from a public relations point of view. They just announced that we're not going to consider whether there's a double standard or not. You're just not allowed to talk about it. Political activity of any kind, political affairs are banned. You just can't talk about it. And so there's just a code of silence on the double standard. So these ideas of sort of indifference to democracy really influenced the first generation of development economists. Gunnar Myrdal said that super planning, which when you read between the lines, sounds like the all-powerful state, because it's staged with largely, to Gunnar Myrdal, the citizens were certainly not ready for their own leadership because they were largely illiterate and apathetic. That was the viewpoint of development in 1956, and yet it continues to be the view today. The World Bank Growth Commission said in 2008, it had as one of its strongest conclusions that growth at such a quick pace over such a long period requires strong political leadership. It's a very artful euphemism, strong political leadership, because it's kind of the old, it's putting in more neutral terms the still very prevalent myth of the benevolent autocrat who is necessary for development, or the developmental state that's necessary for development. The World Bank Growth Commission is only revealing its hand by what it does not say. It did not call for strong citizens. It did not call for a strong, loyal opposition. It did not call for strong dissidents. It did not call for a strong democracy. It only called for strong leadership, with no talk of checks and balances and checks against the arbitrary power of those leaders to violate the rights of their citizens, and thereby destroying the whole notion of accountability, democratic accountability to the citizens. So we're left now with the question of, can the tragedy that has gone on for centuries now of the double standard in development, can this tragedy end at last? The good news is that peoples around the world, despite the lack of support from the development establishment, that they're campaigning on their own for greater rights and accountability, with gradual but persistent success. And the cause of individual rights and liberties, human rights and democracy is winning around the world. The share of societies with those rights is rising over time. So, despite the tragic indifference the development established to the double standard, rights for the rich, not for the poor, peoples are campaigning on their own for greater rights and greater democracy. It's to them, really, that and not to the development establishment, that we look for the greatest hope for the 21st century. So let me conclude by saying, once again, using the real words, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And let us all ourselves act as dissidents, as rebels, as exercising our rights of free speech, of criticism, that we will not shut up until the principle that all men are created equal is recognized for Muslims and Christians, for women and men, for black men and white men, equal rights for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we'll move straight on to Agnès, who will talk about accountability, transparency, and freedom of expression in Africa. We'll have questions.
So I'm going to try to give you an overview of the situation for freedom of expression and transparency in Africa and what it means in terms of state accountability. I have, the previous speaker has really set the tone very nicely, very well, around some of the key issues. I will begin that quick presentation with a small discussion on accountability. It's a key, central theme for the conference, although I must confess that this is not a concept that I like very much, even though I have worked on it for many years. The first reason why I don't like it is because it's not translatable in many other languages besides English, which I think does raise some questions about why is it being so used, why so few other people besides English speakers can actually translate it. Second, I think it's very much the product of a certain time and a certain class of people who were, I believe, trying to depoliticize the key issues of power and responsibilities. As a result, there have been over the last 10, 15 years many struggles around the terms and how to define it in order, I think, to make it more meaningful for people around the world. The way I'm approaching accountability is, of course, from the human rights standpoint, and it's very much grounded in the question and the notion of responsibility and duty on the part of people with power. So from the standpoint of Article 19, which for which I am working, but most human rights organizations around the world, accountability is really about mediating power. It's about holding those that have power to account, making them answerable to the people, and ensuring that the sovereignty that has been delegated by the people to elected representatives is used for their interest as well. As a result, to discuss accountability is really to discuss power. And to discuss power is really to discuss human rights, as Bill has highlighted in the previous, in his discussion. Nevertheless, and for the sake of this discussion, I've attempted to build a concept of accountability around which I wanted to bring in some of the aspects of how freedom of expression in Africa has contributed to that. So I've come up with this, it's not a definition, it has many weaknesses, but I think at least it allows us to try to think in operational terms around accountability. And I have therefore identified 5 key questions to define accountability. The first one is who is accountable, to whom, for what, how, and with which consequences. My presentation will focus very much on question 3 and 4. I think question 1 and 2, as I have explained or highlighted, is really around, for human rights at least, it's about holding those in power, so the who of the accountable can be governments, can be corporations, can be an employer, accountable to whom? To those who have given some kind of authority to that person and therefore want this authority to be used properly. If we, looking at the definition, one of the very central aspects of accountability is that, and human rights, is that you need to have some kind of collective agreement around the what are you accountable for. That's why human rights is particularly important, because it's an attempt to build a framework around which governments upon which governments should build their activities. What I would like to highlight here is the contribution that for the last 20, 30 years, the African regional instrument, but also some domestic one, have made to the normative development of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is recognized in international law under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The African Article 9 of the African Convention on Human Rights has also highlighted the importance of freedom of expression, more or less in similar terms as Article 19, but with a little problem which we refer to as a clawback clause. This clause could have been a major impediment to the development, the normative framework for freedom of expression. Luckily, the African Commission, in some of its jurisprudence, have made it clear that all governments are accountable for freedom of expression, and that freedom of expression can only be limited by an agreed international limitations, which are not necessarily the ones that African governments had initially thought of. I think originally they thought that freedom of expression could be limited by national norms, which kind of denied or hampered the development of freedom of expression. The African Commission has been a major actor in protecting, at least in normative terms, freedom of expression on the African continent. And from that standpoint, is probably globally a very important actor for freedom of expression, alongside, although not exactly at the same level as the European instruments or the inter-American instruments, but I think it's worth highlighting that it's certainly way ahead in normative terms of most of what's happening is in Asia or in the Middle East. Another key aspect of the protection, the normative protection of freedom of expression in Africa is the African Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. Again, there are not that many special instruments around the world to protect freedom of expression, but there is one in Africa, established in 2004. The current post holder is Pansit Lakula. She's a fantastic fighter for freedom of expression and has really contributed a great deal to entrench the normative standard understanding of freedom of expression throughout the continent. Some of the limitations, of course, at the moment is that the regional court, the African Court for Human Rights, is still not operational. There have been only one case, and he decided it was not could not deal with that case. And the regional instruments, I think, as I put in my that slide, the jury is out. So we're not quite sure yet how the ECA, ECOWAS, or NEPAD even will be handling freedom of expression, and whether they will be strengthening the normative framework for its defense or weakening it. I think the next 5 to 10 years will be very important on that. For that purpose. I think the point here is to acknowledge that Africa as a continent, as a political body, has done quite a lot in normative, at least in terms of setting up freedom of expression as a norm. Certainly more than some other continents, like I mentioned, Asia or the Middle East, and is continuing to do so. There are a number of things that are in the agenda right now which highlight a commitment to building a normative framework for the defense of freedom of expression. The second point I would like to make is that within the last 20 years, the defense of freedom of expression and transparency throughout the continent, at least the freedom of expression, has really been phenomenal. It is not specific to Africa, but it has been very important in Africa. Over the last 15 years, we moved from a majority of governments owning the media to a situation where most media is now privately owned, that the concept of media diversity, which is not, which can't by itself sustain freedom of expression, but is certainly an important component of freedom of expression. There is an emergence of media pluralism. By this I mean, media pointing forward a variety of viewpoints. It's not there yet, but it's certainly far better than it was 15 years ago, and it's certainly more or less in pair with many other regions in the world. I think most interestingly for us freedom of expression activists has been the complete transformation of the technological environment for free expression in Africa. The mobile technology has had in Africa the fastest growth in the world. Over a 10 years period, it moved from 11 to 246 million subscription. And for those of you that read African business, the current one, I think it's this month, is all about the development of mobile technology in Africa. It is phenomenal, and I think it it's important to highlight because we, in most people's mind, they don't associate Africa with the forefront of technological revolution, but they are wrong when it comes to mobile technology. The continent is really at the forefront of it. And in many ways, thanks to mobile technology, the digital divide around access to internet is slowly being reduced. People won't access internet like most you and I do through our computer because of electricity, because of the slow connection and so on, but they will access, and they are accessing in Africa increasingly, information through internet. I was in Kenya not very long ago, and what really struck me was how many Kenyans, maybe not in the most rural areas, but in most of the countries, were accessing information via their phone, and how many of them were actually interacting with the information that they were receiving. And I think that's a very important dimension of the African media landscape, which needs further study, but is certainly worth emphasizing. So if you remember my operational framework for accountability, there was a question of for what are we accountable and how. There have been many progresses made, certainly for what, in terms of the normative framework. Many at the regional level, it is there. At the domestic level, not yet, but there are certainly in the Constitution, freedom of expression is well enshrined. How? Progresses have been made there as well through the pluralism of the media, through political elections, which I have not mentioned, but there have certainly been a multiplication of those, and through technology. This being said, though, I will not want to give the impression that all is pink, as we say in French. There are many unfinished business and unfulfilled promises when it comes to freedom of expression and transparency, and therefore accountability. So in terms of the normative framework, despite all the progresses, unfortunately there remains many regressive laws, some of them dating back to the colonial eras. The two main problems for us for Article 19 and other free expression activists are really around criminal defamation and security laws. Again, this is not specific to Africa. You will find the same problems in many other parts of the world. But it is certainly very important on the continent as far as criminal defamation is concerned, which means that a large number of journalists are imprisoned, probably the largest number in the world, and there is a big deal of self-censorship as a result. Security laws is on the increase, linked to the war on terror and anti-terrorism, and you can see a number of attempts made by governments around the world, including in Africa, to strengthen their security framework. All of that has negative implications for freedom of expression. So the normative framework is still weak. When it comes to freedom of expression, it is also, what is also weak is the how, the instrument that are going to allow us to hold people to account is fairly weak, as is remaining weak and is probably getting weaker. At least this is a trend that we've identified for the last 3 or 4 years. In her latest report, the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression in Africa did say, in a very diplomatic way, because she's got to be diplomatic, we are losing some of the gains that we had made. And that is the same conclusion that has been reached by Article 19 and by all of our colleagues working on free expression in Africa. The last 5 years have not been very positive. Some of the reasons, well, some of the aspects of these problems, rather, I'll deal with the reason later, are the pluralism of the media, the multiplication of ownership of the media has not resulted into more media diversity, meaning more information of public interest and locally made, strong focus on entertainment, and for you who are from Africa or who live in Africa, you know that the quality and the professionalism of the media still need to leave a lot to be desired. The key issue I want to emphasize here, because we're talking about state accountability, is really what I consider to be one of the main obstacles at the moment is the absence of independent regulation of the media in Africa, which means that basically all broadcasters are so dependent on the state or on people of power that you can't really be expecting a fully free and independent media in that circumstances. The other main weaknesses within the current situation in Africa is related to transparency, which I'm just going to talk about very quickly now. Again, transparency is one of those terms that we use all the time, but which has no agreed international definition. Different actors have different definitions, but in a nutshell, it's essential to accountability, and it's being open and giving information on issues that should be of public interest. One essential element to transparency is the so-called access to information laws, of which there are about 90 in the world. Unfortunately, only 6 in Africa, and 3 of them are actually about preventing information to be accessible rather than giving access to that information. So the transparency revolution that have taken place in many parts of the world has not happened in Africa, and that is really what distinguishes the continent from some other places around the world. There is little evidence of progress made on that front for the last 10 years. I can't get into all the details because I'm running short of time, but suffice to say that the secrecy remains really the modus operandi of governments throughout the continent. In conclusion, I haven't had the time to deal with some of the factors or the reasons behind the progresses and then the setback. The last 10 years, human rights activists and free expression activists in particular have recorded many setbacks around the world as far as free expression is concerned. That setback has also occurred in Africa. It has not been worse in Africa, but neither has it been less. We're still discussing the reason for that setback. I mean, clearly 9/11 and the security agenda and the war on terror have been quite fundamental to the human rights recession. The food crisis, the economic recession in some part of the world has not helped. The arrival on the global scene of new actors, which are not necessarily very human rights friendly, but are nevertheless very crucial political and economic actors such as China, Russia, Brazil, even to a lesser extent. All of these developments mean that the protection for human rights and the development and the push for stronger human rights protection in Africa or elsewhere has actually weakened in many years. In the past, some countries that were held as human rights models have completely lost their legitimacy, while a number of new actors have emerged on the global scene who don't really care about human rights. So that's one of the factors of the last 10 years, which are, I think, of great concern to all of us. Something that is more specific to Africa, in my opinion, and needs a bit more explanation and work, is that for the last 3 to 4 years, there have been a number of elections in Africa, and elections are always moments where people get very cranky and very, people we thought were actually quite accountable are actually not at all. And the recent elections in Africa have been very interesting from that standpoint because they have well highlighted the limit of state accountability at the moment. There have been Rwanda, Ethiopia, to name just a few, Uganda. So they have acted, I will say, as a trigger factor and have strengthened or pushed back the progresses that had been made around freedom of expression and freedom of the media. In conclusion, it's very similar to what Bill how Bill concluded his presentation. I don't think that within the years to come we will be able to rely on a great deal of external or global forces to help entrench accountability in Africa. I think that economic actors won't be looking for that. The new BRIC, the new multipolar world will not be necessarily very conducive to it. So we will be left with our own, basically, meaning people like you, I hope, and like me, civil societies in Africa, the media ready to fight for their rights and to really continue to push the boundaries of state accountability and strengthen the sovereignty of the people. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. The ambit of my discussion is whether the state can deliver democracy and accountability. And Agnès has covered this topic, and she has been telling us that the glass is 1/10 full, and I'm going to tell you that the glass is 9/10 empty. Why and what needs to be done? The political environment, as well as the political geography of Africa, is more a creation of exogenous or external factors than the domestic forces. If Bismarck should not be recognized only for uniting Germany, but also for the fact that he united Africa. We don't know what Africa was before him, but rather we know what Africa is after that as far as the geography is concerned. he brought together the, as you very well know, the powers of the day and peacefully divided Africa among themselves. And at the end of the Second World War, two powers, France and Britain, controlled something like 80% of the region. And there were contiguous areas that were covered. But later at independence, they were broken down to smaller pieces. Now today, we have something like 48 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in these 48 countries, really nobody knows how many people live in Africa. And you can take your figures, you can make your numbers, and you can challenge whoever is going to say you are wrong by asking him to give you another number. And whatever number you cite, I think it is correct. But in any case, the consensus goes for something like 800 million. And these 800 million are distributed in these 48 countries. And just looking at the viability, this is where this is where we have one of the problems. 7 of these countries have a population that is less than 1 million. 19 have a population that is less than 5 million. 26 countries have a population that is less than 10 million. 31 of them have a population that is less than 15 million. 37 have a population that is less than 20 million. And 41 have a population that is less than 30 million. Only 3 countries have a population that is greater than 50 million. Ethiopia with 85 million, Congo Democratic Republic with 71 million, and of course Nigeria with 150 million. Those are now the population distributions that you have. The question is, how do these people live? What is the social and economic conditions? This is, very well known that Africa is, and Africans are in a bad shape. And just to give you some ideas, of the 50 countries that have been designated as least developed by UNDP and UNCTAD, 34 are from Africa. And in these 34 countries, an estimated 500 million people live. Human Development Report, the latest copy of which was distributed to us yesterday, shows that on average the Human Development Index in Africa is less than 0.4, and that it has the lowest level of human development. On a per capita income, something like the 800 million Africans that I cited to you earlier produced something like $700 billion in 2009, and that will give you a per capita income of $830 per person per year. That amounts to something like $2.30 per day on a per capita basis. And keep in mind that the minimum wage in New York is more than $7 per hour, while an African is subsisting on about $2 per hour, per day. As far as the World Bank is concerned, something like 400 million people live on less than $1 a day. That's $1.25 a day. That's the international dollar. And something like 600 million live on less than $2 international dollars a day. And you can imagine the kind of life, that one would be able to lead with these kinds of resources. Infrastructure-wise, really there is nothing that has been done in Africa. And I am not using the high-tech because I come from a continent where, the information communication revolution has bypassed us. And so I don't perhaps know how to even use it. Agnès had talked about the mobile phone. Let me take the 246 or the 250 mobile phones that are, in Africa. 800 million people, 246 million mobiles. In general, it has been said that there are more telephones in the borough of Manhattan, not in New York City, the borough of Manhattan, than are available in the entire sub-Saharan Africa. We could go on with the litany or the indices of misery, but I think this will give you an idea of where Africa is. But in general, one conclusion, and as Bill has rightly pointed out, Africans are surviving more by international charity than the charity of their own governments. And of course, this needs to change. The underdevelopment that we have in the African region is a product, of course, of three factors. One is the external, which Bill has so eloquently presented. The other are the African people and the African states. As far as the people are concerned, they would want to have a better standard of living. I mean, this is simply common sense. They would strive to have a better standard of living, but they are prevented from doing so. And I mean, actually prevented. It's not a question of minimizing the situation, so trying to create a more, a better picture, but actually prevented. And I will try to explain that. And of course, the cause is at the bottom, the state. When it comes to the state, we have two states in Africa. One is what I would want to call the virtual state, and the other is the real state. And the virtual state is, the more civilized state, one with a constitution where we, the people, have, defined for themselves their own visions and their own ways of being governed in terms of powers that are divided and controlled and accountability and all that kind of thing. And this is the virtual state. Actually, this state simply exists in the imagination of those who are ruling and the international community. It does not exist in Africa. What exists in Africa is the real state. And that state is governed by and directed by people who assume the power for the simple reason that, having power is beneficial. This, consider a simple game theoretic model where you have an objective of gaining power and keeping it, and you perceive that others are trying to take it away from you, and your goal is to make sure that power remains with you. And that is the essence and the objective of the leadership that we have. And anything that seems to be threatening to this kind of situation would be dealt with regardless of how, humane or otherwise it is. And that happens to be the way the people are going to be governed. The international community has been taken over, and they assume that the virtual state is the real state. They know that that is not the case, but in any case, they have concluded that they would want to deal with the virtual state. And whatever errors and wrongdoings happen to emerge from the real state, it is always talked of as being a process, a transition, for which people must be patient. And it's not the people who are being governed that are being patient, but the rest of the world in terms of their observation of such inhumane relationship treatments. So the essence is the real state would want to reduce whatever challenge there is to it, and it is within this model or within this reality that we should be focusing as far as the results of development are concerned. There is no private sector development in Africa, because if the private sector develops, the people are going to be rich, and rich people are going to be more difficult to rule over compared to poor people. So the idea is not to come up with viable, real models to develop the private sector. You can talk about the private sector development. The World Bank has been spending millions of dollars trying to develop the private sector, and the private sector remains underdeveloped. As far as human capacity is concerned, again, educated people are going to be a threat, and you have a lot of Africans, very well trained, very capable, running away from Africa. In the African case, migration is a result more of a push from Africa rather than a pull from the rest of the world. And this, again, is simply because educated people, skilled people are seen as a threat by the regime. Oftentimes, people talk about corruption. I think, and there are certain assumptions that are being made about Africa, but one of the things is that there is corruption in Africa. I think that's a misnomer, because what has happened in Africa is the state has been privatized. The state is a private property of those people who are in power. And in essence, what happens is that the machinery is used to take away the resources from the people and pass it over to the leadership, who in turn would be, distributing or redistributing it to their assistants and their supporters, or people who are going to keep them in power. So it's not a case of corruption, it's just a case of ownership and redistribution. And therefore, if we are going to live in this kind of situation, and I think we have to honestly acknowledge that the state have the responsibility, then we have to start talking about what we need to do. And obviously, we need to change, the state. And oftentimes, the focus in changing, the regime, changing the person who is in power. And again, that's not enough, because it is not the person who is responsible, but rather it is the system. And what we need to do is really to change the system into a more democratic situation. Oftentimes, again, assumptions are made about the structural adjustment program and the ideas of the World Bank trying to, marketize the whole operations, economic operations of the African region. There is this wrong assumption that the institutions of the market or the conditions under which the market operates exist in Africa, but they do not. Like, property is not private. There is no private property as such, and whatever the head of state or the big person decides, could be taken away from you. And there is no rule of law, and contracts are not going to be respected for the simple reason that the mechanism for these kinds of actions do not exist, and that's why we don't have markets in Africa. It's not a question of not wanting, or having people who would want to take advantage of the market and try to improve their lot. So what we need really is to change not only the people who are in power, but we have to change the regime itself. There must be a regime change in the sense that the objectives and the mechanisms of government must change. And in this, with respect to the objective, I think we have to make the state more ideal. We have to make it accountable. We have to make it work for the good of the people. And we cannot really do away with the state. The state is necessary to help develop Africa. And without the involvement of the state, we cannot develop. And so the idea is to change it into one that is going to advance development. And for this, we have to really make it democratic. Now, again, there is a wrong assumption about democracy. Democracy in Africa, in the rest of the world, is a means by which you are going to protect your rights. You already have rights in order to exercise, your democracy, and democracy would be a means by which you are protecting those rights. But in Africa, I don't know why you are trying to talk about democracy when the essential elements of a democratic environment does not exist. The people simply don't have any right to choose or to select, and others are not going to offer themselves for to the people for election, for the simple reason that it is made impossible. And then we are going to talk about elections in Africa, democratic elections in Africa. You are going to have international observers who come in, and they go back with, it has not met international standards. And what does it mean? It simply means that there is no democracy. So I think we should be trying to make the society more democratic, and in this we need the support of the international community. And there's one thing that is very important, and that is during the old days, and the United States, the West was competing against the Soviet Union. Now there is a new boy in town, and this is China. Again, the United States is competing with China in order to have, to make sure that the governments are going to remain friendly to the United States and, of course, to China. But this is where the problem is. The Chinese are assisting and supporting an authoritarian dictatorial regimes. And the United States also is competing against the Chinese to, help and support these same dictatorial regimes. And at the end of the day, it is going to be the people who are going to win. And I hope, the United States with its values of freedom and liberty would tend to support the people rather than non-democratic authoritarian regimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we had three extremely stimulating speakers. I must say I come away feeling that both Bill and Agnès said, well, you can't really expect the state to deliver. You have to count on the people themselves in the countries to lead.
Prabhakaran, an alumnus of New School. My question is more aspect of what Dr. Easterly touched upon. It has to do with strong political leadership. I think the emphasis on that leadership was made by Western organizations as a condition precedent to giving aid, if I understood correctly. And there is a need for that kind of leadership even now in undeveloped society. And at the time they coined that expression, the need was more. Even now it is absent for the obvious reason. Many people could have provided, those who could have provided the leadership are preoccupied with solving the other basic problem, the problem of poverty. At an individual level, feeding the children, feeding the family, that's the basic problem. So these Western organizations, should they have waited until the leadership emerges from within, or is it not advisable that the leadership comes from without? In which case, there is a danger of that being characterized as white man's burden or things like that. So how to resolve this dilemma, if you can throw some light on that?
What I suggest is we take 4 questions at a time.
From Rutgers University, Department of Africana Studies. My question is directly to Dr. Easterly and also Dr. Degefe, so any of the panelists can answer this. If the question is, if factors that really shape Africa's underdevelopment, if those factors are largely exogenous or say geopolitical, then shouldn't the solution to these pervasive problems of impunity in its totality, poverty, gender asymmetry, be largely exogenous?
Development and policy at Teachers College. The question is focused more at Dr. Easterly's comments about double standards. And it seems like if we accept this linear idea of development, we're keeping a double standard even in looking at the United States development. That slide you showed about we the people, it didn't really send chills up my body because it took over almost 200 years for us to even actualize those principles as related to blacks or women or other individuals as well. And the idea that countries that are coming out of colonial regimes, coming out of oppressive states, are going to overnight become models of success in democracy seems like it's a little bit unrealistic. So the question is, do you not really validate the notion of transitional governments, or do you believe that hard transitions should not be supported by official development assistance?
UN peacekeeper. Just Dr. Easterly brought up the question of the Democratic Republic of Congo and U.S. aid during 2001. I'd just like to ask him and the other panelists, it's a question of practical accountability, both for African governments and other, the international community in general, particularly Western governments. During that time, the U.S. and Britain in particular, but also the EC and others, were funding Rwanda and Uganda to, while they were occupying, and you could say either they did it, complicitly, or at the very least, which is a war crime according to the Rome Statute, they knew, because there have been numerous reports before, that there had been an invasion, there were occupations, there was horrible human rights abuses going on, and yet they funded this. So normally they would have a legal responsibility to, provide some kind of payment. There should be some kind of justice. Now, Uganda was condemned by the International Court of Justice. Rwanda has never been condemned because Rwanda simply refuses to adhere to any sort of accountability. The extractive, any court whatsoever, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, despite being an initiative of Britain, Britain has never obliged Rwanda or Uganda to become a member of it. So in that context, practically, what should the solution be? Should the USAID not give the money, and then should Congo then try and pursue it in the courts, either in the US under the Alien Torts Law, or should they just withhold all the aid that we're going to give to Uganda and Rwanda and give it to the Congo, even given the Congo situation? What would be the practical answer? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for these comments to all of us. So the first question mentioned that people concerned with starvation is that do they really care about democratic rights? Well, I think that's been a very traditional, long-standing argument for perpetuating the double standard, is that people who are at a subsistence level don't care. And that presumes that there is some autocratic alternative that would somehow better meet their needs and get them faster out of starvation than the democratic alternative, whereas I think the democratic alternative has a much better track record for getting starving people out of starvation. So that's democracy is part of the solution to their needs, not part of the problem. The exogenous geopolitical reasons I certainly accept. We can't do much about them as scholars and academics and activists, but we can continue to expose hypocrisy. This question about linear development and about ideals versus the actuality in the U.S., I think this is a very, very important comment. I think you could argue that what has made sort of successful campaigns for the rights of African Americans, for example, in the U.S., has been the recognition of the ideal that all men are created equal. And so that the ideal, recognizing the ideal, really made it possible for campaigners for, first ending the abolition of slavery. Lincoln very explicitly cited the Declaration of Independence, as all men are created equal, as hypocrisy, and was able to use that argument to mobilize the campaign to abolish slavery. And then 100 years later, Martin Luther King was able to use the same phrase from the Declaration of Independence that I quoted to, expose the hypocrisy by which blacks were denied equal rights. And so, I think the ideals are important to make it possible for political campaigns. They take longer than we would like, but they're a lot faster when the ideals are recognized and the campaigns can point to the hypocrisy. And the tragic situation of development today is not even the ideal is recognized. That we don't even really accept the ideal that poor people do have those same political and civil liberties and individual freedoms. And so, the campaign to achieve more freedom in the developing countries, which, yes, I do agree is a gradual and slow process, and no, I don't expect perfect democracy to appear overnight. But if we would recognize the ideal, then the campaign for democratic rights would get a lot farther along than it does now. Lastly, the question about financing Rwanda and Uganda. Yeah, I think the aid agencies were very complicit in war crimes and autocracy by financing, by continuing to finance Uganda and Rwanda while they were invading DR Congo and committing war crimes. And I think the general principle is don't finance political repression, don't finance war crimes, don't finance invasions of neighboring countries. These seem like, brainless, obvious recommendations, except that the aid agencies continue to routinely violate them.
Well, I must say that, the idea that the ideals are not recognized, I think is not entirely, reflected in all of the declarations and the commitments that have been made. I mean, people have no difficulty agreeing on the destination and the ideal, but there's a tremendous amount of disagreement about how to get there. There is no agreement about the appropriate means. So, if you look at any UN declaration about democracy or human rights or peace, I think you will find all of these ideals clearly recognized for all countries and all people of the world. It's more in the action, in the behavior, that I think that these ideals are actually not being recognized. And if you want development aid to do something about it, I think we should be worried about what development agencies are going to do about democracy and accountability and human rights. After all, if the World Bank would not get macroeconomic policies right for all countries, do you want conditionality of the World Bank to design appropriate democratic institutions that would work in all countries of the world? It sort of mind boggles at that point. But anyway, let me pass on to the other two.
Can I just give you a quick response? Yes, there are UN declarations, but the documents and the speeches, they continue to evade using clear language that would recognize the ideals of rights. At the recent Millennium Development Goals Summit at the UN in September, the word democracy was conspicuously absent in the entire discussion, both by leaders from rich countries and those from poor countries. And from the UN agencies and from the World Bank. You cannot get World Bank President Zelek to say democracy. It's just, or individual rights. You just can't get it. It just doesn't happen. So in that sense, the ideals are not even recognized.
Well, the right to development is actually in the Millennium Declaration and in the 2010 Declaration. But anyway, let me pass on to Agnès next.
Actually, I was just going to follow up on those points. I do think that that we are confronting a stronger ideological battles around the questions of rights and rights protection within the development agenda, and it is one of the key drivers of the next decade. The emphasis on economic development and the fact that a number of new actors, including China, India, Russia, are becoming major global actors, means that the battle around the heart, the importance of rights and democracy is far more difficult to fight, including at a discourse level. So I will tend to agree very much with Bill. We experience it almost. We can see the deterioration of the discourse and therefore of the implications of it in practical terms. Human rights is not considered as essential to economic development, and in fact, I will suspect that for some people it is an entrance to human rights development. It's an old debate, when I was a student many years ago, but it's certainly back on at the forefront of policy making at the moment, partly because of China, and partly because of Rwanda, which is which is being highlighted as an example of some kind of economic growth in Africa in the context of rights violation. So I do think the context is actually a very difficult one for the global and regional context for rights protection and accountability.
Befekadu.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on what you said in terms of the intense discourse that is possible about the desirability of having respect for human rights and democracy, so on and so forth. But the problem is whether there is a real commitment to put this into practice. We could be talking about them, so many different conferences, so many different venues and all that kind of thing that do discuss the desirability of this ideal situation. The problem is one commitment. And as far as the results in the developing countries is concerned, there has always been a partnership between exogenous factors and endogenous factors. The question is, which of these factors was more responsible and is really influencing the domestic outcome? During the colonial period, obviously it was exogenous factors that were very important. And after independence, the exogenous factors, reduced the degrees of their involvement, but they were there. But the one important point is that they have left the household, management to the local forces, whether this was during the colonial period or whether this is during independence. The management of the people has been left to the domestic authorities, and the external factors they have simply been maintaining or protecting their own national interests. But the partnership was there. But the important thing is how to change this commitment to the idea into a real practical project as far as the global community. Thank you.
So let's take another couple of rounds. So please.
Hello, my name is Brett Barnes. My question is about perhaps one of these exogenous forces, and that would be arms trafficking and the link between arms trafficking and endemic the weakness of states, which the violence which continues to keep populations weak, unable to realize democracy. The appointment of John Bolton to the UN evidently resulted in some systematic whatever you call, withholding of progress for UN efforts to rein in trafficking of weapons. Other American politicians, such as Jesse Helms, also were activists to prevent constraining this traffic. Do American extractors, Europeans, and now presumably Chinese recognize the contributor of a weak state to profitability in extractive industries, though they never have to explicitly state that from a congressional floor?
Yes, my name is Nagash. I'm Ethiopian by birth, and I work in the private sector. I wanted to thank you all for your presentation. I have lived mostly in New York, but I have traveled and worked in Ethiopia, and I think I can say there's reasonable grounds to say aid has done more harm than good in Ethiopia's case. And I thank Professor Easterly for having brought this fact to the forefront, at least to shame the donors who refuse to be shamed by and large. It seems from the presentation that the social contract in Africa is big with the African governments and the Western donors, not with their local constituency. And this continues to be the case, and that's what Dr. Befekadu was saying. I just want to ask the question and also the proposal. Just the way you have the Hippocratic oath for doctors, is it possible to propose a donor, do no harm? At the minimum, not the upper level, but at the ground level, because there is substantive evidence, especially the darling of all aid donors, Ethiopia, that there is substantial evidence that it is keeping the poor people poor and oppressed. And not much research has gone into this. And if we can propose this from both NGOs, to both NGOs and the official donors such as the government and the World Bank and the UN, that at the minimum, they take oath not to do any harm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. My name is Ibrahim. I am a student at Columbia University, and I have two questions. One is about human rights and for Agnès, and the other is about development for Degefe. When you spoke about development, you never mentioned, you said exogenous forces, but I think that you need to define what exogenous is, because what I understand is it's pure capitalism, and also to explain how capitalism is systematically underdeveloping Africa. That was not explained. The state are at fault, yes, but how is capitalism systematically underdeveloping Africa? That's my question. And number two for Agnès, on the human rights issue, on freedom of expression, your argument was based on Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I did not hear anything about the African Charter for Human and People's Rights. I know that there is a contention between these two documents, but for human rights in Africa, which one suits Africa better? Is it the Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was the product of Hitler's aggression, or the African Charter for Human Rights? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more because there's so many people who want to raise questions. Yes, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Sadiq Musa. I'm from Multimedia University, Malaysia. Originally, I'm Sudanese. I'm coming away from Malaysia here to share with you the views. And unfortunately, we Africans normally, they told us what to do. You never listen to our views. So I'm carrying the African views. When you talk about democracy in Africa and accountability, human rights, like you put someone in the sea and he doesn't know how to swim. So what is happening to someone, he put inside the ocean and he doesn't know how to swim. The problem with Africa is the failure of institutions. We don't have institutions, we don't have economic fundamentals. How the government and democracy is going to work with no institutions? None of you are unable to talk about institutions in Africa and the role of institutions in development. We need to develop institutions. We don't want aid. We have a lot of resources. We need technical assistance. We need help without any interference to develop our resources, to live like all the people. We have a lot of resources. When you talk about Sudan, human rights, crime against humanity, the real issue is the oil against humanity. You like our oils. You want to kill us. You want to divide Sudan, and you say criminal against humanity. Is oil against humanity, actually? We need technical help to develop institutions. We don't need for you to tell us how to rule our countries. We are totally different. We don't have civil society that you have. Our countries are based on tribals. We don't move to civil society to have a democracy accountability. As you know, people will make the change, not the government or leaders. Now people are talking about human capital, skilled people. Why you are attracting all the people to come to US here? You want skilled people to develop your country. Those people will make the change. If you put Bush or you put Obama, it doesn't matter because you have the institutions. So the question is, I want you to address is a failure of institution in Africa in general and legal institution failure and their role in the development of Africa in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My comment is about Agnès' presentation. When she spoke about accountability in Africa.
Microphone, please.
Oh.
And can you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, I'm Jean-Vier Burunziza from UNDP and Burundi. So when Agnès presented about accountability in Africa, I just wanted to know whether she looked at the real state or the virtual state, and I'm very thankful to Befekadu for offering these two concepts, because I think in several states in Africa, several countries in Africa, so the virtual state is kind of okay. When you look at the texts, the legal texts, they are okay. The constitutions, they are okay, but it's really the way they are put in practice or the way they are implemented which is problematic. It doesn't matter whether the Constitution says that I'm free, that I have all the rights that another guy has in the US, but in real terms, or do I actually enjoy those rights in actual terms? I remember I once was presenting a paper at somewhere at Cambridge at a conference organized by the NBER, and I was talking about Burundi. Actually, Bill was there. It's the NBER project conference. So I was talking about the economy in Burundi and how the state actually prevents the economy from going ahead, from growing. And I remember one prominent economist, an American prominent economist, who made a comment, and he was very frank and very sincere, and he thought he was really helping. He said, you know, the solution to your problem in Burundi is to try and craft a constitution which looks like the American Constitution. So it was so naive, but I couldn't tell him that it was very naive, very, prominent professor. I just thanked him, and during the break, I tried to talk to him. So it's not really about the texts, it's about the way they are put into practice. So I just need some thought from Agnès on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's start first this time with Befekadu.
Well, I join the commentators as far as the values that should be reflected is concerned. I am very much encouraged to hear that, at least about the possibility of having some kind of a code of conduct for both the donors as well as those people who are distributing the aid within Africa, that they should be committed to not doing any harm. And I think it is about time that the donor community took responsibility for the negative impact of their goodwill and the resources they are willing to provide to assist and help. African views obviously are not heard, and that everything is externalized as far as the economic policy in Africa is concerned, whether this is a pro-food growth or structural adjustment program or whatever, they are sourced from outside. And that is simply because the people are not involved. The private sector or the people are not part of the development process. They are on the receiving end. And because of the external, the political pressure that they are subjected to, they have sort of exited from the process. They cannot stand against this mammoth force, which is the government. And so what has happened is that they have simply excluded themselves. And whatever the government says, they say, and nothing happens. And as a result, really, there is no African opinion, no African views as far as how to develop themselves are concerned. But definitely they do have, opinions. Definitely they do have modalities. Definitely they know their problems. And you cannot tell them what their problem is when you are not going to listen to what their problems are.
That I think is, what we have today.
Couple of comments. Either I was not did not speak very well, I'm a bit tired, maybe jet lagged. Regarding the question on the African Charter, I actually thought I highlighted the role of African instruments in building up, in contributing to an international understanding of freedom of expression and building up an African-based understanding of freedom of expression. Article 9 of the African Charter did contradict the international standard of Article 19, but the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights made it clear that, or put forward an interpretation of Article 9 which is in alliance with Article 19 of the International Convention. So there is no contradiction there according to a specifically regional instrument, the African Commission. The African Commission has been instrumental, essential. It is, I think, one of the great component of the last 20 years in terms of human rights development in Africa. So there are, I haven't mentioned the African Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Freedom of Information, which is also extremely useful. The African Commissions on a regular basis as a jurisprudence. People file complaints. The African Commission rules on those complaints, and that is building up a jurisprudence, a specifically African jurisprudence on freedom of expression, in addition to the way national courts are going to rule over freedom of expression. So there is absolutely no doubt that the continent altogether has built an African-based understanding of freedom of expression, and that this understanding is very much in keeping with the way the so-called international standards have developed. There are very few, or if any, contradictions between the two, and I really want to insist that, in my opinion, the last 15 years, the development in terms of the regional body of norms and cases of freedom of expression is exemplary, and we need to really look for some good, not only always look for the bad story. There are some very fantastic development in Africa which needs to be highlighted. That will link up with the questions of the virtuous versus real state. In 20 minutes, I couldn't get into all aspects of the continent, which is very large, with many countries, all of which differ from each other. So the real state, yes, there are aspects, there are some conclusions that can be extracted, which may be applied to the continent altogether. That, I think, for me at least, is very straightforward. There have been fantastic changes within the last 20 years in terms of freedom of expression across the continent, and I must apologize for my phone. I thought I left it at home. And I know that we want to speak about the bad things, and I'm hearing a lot of negative stories, but it doesn't, for me, in human rights terms, in freedom of expression terms, I'm sorry, but those stories don't match the evidence on the ground. There have been many positive changes for the last 15 years, particularly over the 1990s and the 2000s, in terms of freedom of expression. This is an overall conclusion. It doesn't characterize every single country, and as I have highlighted in my brief presentation, over the last 5 years there has been a setback. Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Sudan, Senegal, which has seen a complete drop from where it used to be as a possible model down to where it is at the moment, with hopefully some hope. Even South Africa at the moment is going mad and is putting forward some very weird ideas. I just can't get into the details on a country-by-country basis. There have been some good things, some bad things. There is a setback over the last 5 years that we need to watch out. We really need to push back what is happening. And the failure of the institutions, I think the weakness of the institution is a real problem. In some countries we can talk of failures, in other countries we certainly can talk of weaknesses. In my paper, one of the points points I'm making is that the setback for me is particularly worried in Africa because of the weakness of the institutions. So you have the same setback all over the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and so on. But in Africa, because the institutions, particularly for rights protections, are still weak, that's why I'm very worried about the impact of the setback in the long term.
Thank you. Bill?
And there is a lot of civil society in Africa. It's completely wrong to say that there is no civil society in Africa. It's a very vibrant, rich continent in terms of civil society. I'm sorry. Multiplication of NGOs, of people-driven initiatives. We really can't speak of no civil society in Africa.
Okay, I wanted to respond to the gentleman from Sudan who said, "Don't tell us how to run our countries." I'm really glad you said that. This is a really critical issue for us all to understand when we talk about democracy in someone else's country. What are we talking about, and who should we talk about it to? So for American profs like me and like the Jean-Bier's friend in the last conference that made a ridiculous suggestion about the Constitution. What do we really have the right to sort of autocratically tell some citizens in some other country that we're going to autocratically tell you that you should be democratically free? That's ridiculous. Are we in a superior position as American profs when our forces around the world are violating human rights, when there are violations of human rights at Guantanamo Bay? No, we're not in any kind of superior position to preach to anyone else. And this neocon temptation to impose democracy by force is just a contradiction in terms. That we will coerce you to have the right to be uncoerced. It's just ridiculous. So I totally sympathize with that statement. Don't tell us how to run our countries. And I think the role of kind of academic observers like me or American activists who crusade for the rights of individual rights, human rights, democracy, I think our role is more to talk to our own governments and our own aid agencies. That's our role. Don't tell our own aid agencies that are and the international organizations and our own government aid agencies. Stop being hypocritical. Stop enforcing the double standards. Stop financing repression, like Nagash from Ethiopia said so eloquently. Do no harm, at least. Don't give money to people who are perpetrating human rights violations. That's our role, and I will stop at that role and not be in the role of some kind of superior preacher to other countries about how to have democracy. Democracy means you have to figure it out. That's not my role.
So seriously running out of time. We have 4 minutes, but we have, I think, 10 people waiting to ask questions. Ariane, what do you advise? There are more sessions after this one. Okay. So should we close here, or can we take a couple more questions? All right, okay, so I think we can take 4 more questions and give each one of the panelists 1 minute to make a final response. Okay.
Hi, I'm Liz Fanning. I was a former Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, and I'm the director now of a group called Core Africa. We're starting a national service program opportunity for Africans studying in Malawi and Morocco. And it was really, this whole project came as a response to these types of concerns, because we want to help people become their own leaders in public service. And I've heard Professor Easterly speak a few times about this, and you've been very vocal about, calling about the ego problem of USAID and World Bank and all the other groups. And I'm wondering what their response is. I mean, I know they don't respond directly, they just ignore it, but have they responded directly? Have they said, Bill Easterly is full of crap, or, we think we're doing it right, or have you ever debated them directly? Is USAID part of the problem or part of the solution? I think that would be fascinating.
Okay, yes.
First of all, I want to thank Professor Befekadu and Professor William Easterly bringing light of the Ethiopian issue about corruption in the government. And I have a question directed to Professor Degefe. You wrote Free Inquiry Beyond Risk, and you attributed the misery of the African people to the lack of academic freedom. How can academic freedom be instilled in societies such as Ethiopia, where freedom doesn't exist? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vido. I'm a Ford Foundation scholar from Kenya and a graduate student of Brandeis University in Boston. I have one straight question for the panelists, and my question is, how does lack of effective leadership, weak state capacities and strengths undermine real democracy and accountability for African states? And what's the role of international community in assisting African states in building capacities and strengths of their nations? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Peter, and this is Ciara, and I'm an accountant, and but I only count for half a question. Ciara counts for the other half of our question. How many accountants are in the room? This is an accountability conversation. No accountants. What the hell is going on?
Okay, I mean, I came in late, so this may be a response to everything that I just heard. So excuse me if this is a bit all over the place, but I think it has to be said. I think for someone that said it doesn't really make sense to sort of address constitutions and texts. But I think you have to, because if we sort of take what Benedict Anderson says about the imagined community, well, that's constructed through text, through narratives of history and so on. So it's impossible to sort of distinguish between the two. Those things are very embedded. And that may be a question of discourse. And in response to what someone said before, well, capitalism is the issue. And we know that Marx has made it very far in the global south. And I'm not sort of questioning that. We can say, well, capitalism exists everywhere with the growth of multinational, corporations and so on and so on. It's impossible to ignore. But I'm just wondering that has to be debunked to some extent. Because the fact of the matter is that, we keep talking about the problems that exist, failure of African states and so on. But I think that's a bit problematic because there are many sort of global networks that have been very successful at the same time. So while talking about global capitalism, you also have to sort of talk about other networks that seem to exist outside of that, or even within that sort of provide agency to sort of African states and the global south as a whole. So when we talk about the failure or weaknesses of African states, and that may sort of be due to, history of colonialism and so on, I think we have to widen that discussion to sort of talking about the global south as a whole. And not just nation states, whether they exist or not anymore, with the existence of the EU. The AU hasn't failed, yeah. So I just think this discourse has to be broadened a bit more. And that's my response. I guess it sums up everything, maybe not.
And I want to broaden it to money and accounting.
Thank you very much. So we are very pressed for time, so 1 minute each. I realize that it's really difficult to answer all of the questions, or each of the questions comprehensively, so please make us your final closing statement and respond as best you can to any of the questions that you might wish to. Agnès, why don't you start this time?
What can I say in 1 minute? Yes, I didn't want to engage too much into the conversation around the importance of constitutions and text, and you've made the point very well. I don't know where you are. I think we need to have a good normative framework in place. I mean, that's essential to accountability, which I believe is what we're discussing today. It's not sufficient, but it's certainly an important component of any accountability regime that we want to put in place. I think the only point I would like to add maybe is, as Ethiopia has been mentioned on a number of occasions, for Article 19 and human rights organizations, I think around the world, Ethiopia is a fairly clear example of a country whose dictatorial rule is allowed or is persisting with the complicity of the international community, partly because of the situation in Somalia, partly because of this heavy economic investment that has been made. And the risk, I'm always going back to the global context and the transformation of this multipolar world. The risk is to see more Ethiopia throughout the continent. The intersection of security concerns, of economic ideology, pushing further away the centrality of human rights protection. I think that's the one we need to be very aware of.
Thank you.
Thank you. The question of academic freedom. Last year there was a conference that was organized by AIL, and the proceedings of which appeared in one of the social research publications. And I submitted a paper then, and the title of my paper was Freedom of Inquiry Beyond Risk. The essence of the conference was freedom of inquiry at risk. And in the African context, there is no question of risk because we have passed that stage, and there simply is no freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry. And therefore, when we're talking about academic freedom, really academic freedom in the absence of freedom in the society or within the ocean of repression is simply, I think, a term that is contradictory. It's impossible to have. And therefore, my position is that the freedom of inquiry, freedom of thinking, freedom of expression, including academic freedom, which is one element of it, must coexist within the broader framework of freedom and liberty rather than confined to academic or university settings. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Bill, for the final word.
I just want to answer the question of has the World Bank ever engaged or responded on these issues? So I did have one conversation which I think is posted on the blog that we run at NYU called Aid Watch. So I dealt with someone in the World Bank Office of Public Relations or External Affairs, whatever it's called, and so I asked them, are you in favor? Can you just say whether you're in favor of democracy? And they pointed me to a speech by Mr. Zellick, the president. The speech had no reference to democracy, so I came back to them and said, sorry, there was nothing in the speech. Are you in favor of democracy? And so we kind of went back and forth, and we sort of reached a compromise that they would agree to a statement like, we are not in favor of financing brutal, violent repression, or something like that. And so I followed up. I said, could you, take the next step and just say you're in favor of democracy? And they said, well, I think our previous statement that we're not in favor of financing brutal, violent repression was sufficient.
Well, thank you very much for being here and for the very good questions and comments that were raised. We will reconvene here at 1:30 for the next session.